impact of the presidential election on U.S. trade policy is a topic of my conversation today with John Scannapieco. He chairs the global business team at the law firm of Baker Donelson. Hello, John. Welcome back. Good to talk to you again.
Yeah, you too. You too. Thank you for having me.
So I do want to explore the impact of the presidential election on various aspects, multiple fronts of U.S. policy, and I want to take them sort of one at a time if we can, starting with the U.S. relationship with China. How do you think that's going to change?
I don't think it's going to change all that much initially, simply because if there's one thing that has bipartisan support in Washington today, it's China. And both sides, Democrats, Republicans, view China as I use the word threat. I don't mean to use that in an overly aggressive way, but as a threat to U.S. Competitiveness and the economy. And so I think what you're going to see initially is the tariffs will remain in place. But I think where you will see a difference, whereas the Trump administration viewed China solely as a competitor, I think you'll see with the Biden administration, one, they will still view China as a competitor in many areas, but also as someone to collaborate with as we address some of the serious issues facing us in the world today. For example, public health, so the COVID crisis, North Korea, and then climate change and environmental issues. And then even to some extent, I think on economic issues, simply because there is a realization that both China and the U.S. need each other. You just can't decouple U.S. and China completely, but at the same time, they will recognize that we compete with China. And I think some of the other policies that have, started maybe with the Obama administration and now the Trump administration has picked up on some of his own. I think a lot of those will continue. Tariffs may be lessened over time, but I don't think you'll see that anytime in the first 6 months or even a year.
Would you agree that perhaps that for many years we let slide the issue of intellectual protection, and that maybe the IP thing is going to remain to be a big concern with this new administration as well against
You know,
China?
I don't know if I wouldn't say we let it slide, because if you look at past administrations, they all highlighted this issue and they all tried to address it. It's not an easy thing to address when you are telling one country how they need to address it under their own laws,
Hmm.
because of course there are sovereignty issues and all of the rest. And also, I think the philosophy at the time was, well, if we allow China, say, to enter the World Trade Organization, and we open up, hopefully their economy will open up. Some of these principles that we hold near and dear maybe will then begin to thrive in China. One of which would be to protect intellectual property. I
Hmm.
think, although in the past, China did not have a lot of its own intellectual property to protect. And so there was not really an incentive to really do anything. But now you're seeing, as China is developing its own intellectual property, you are seeing a strengthening of laws. I think what happens a lot of times and what gets the bad press is that US companies, for example, will go into China without having protected their IP. Their
Hmm.
IP gets stolen, and then they complain. When in fact, had they taken the appropriate steps, maybe to register their trademarks, for example, or to seek patent protection, or in their contracts with manufacturers and suppliers and distributors, they actually protect their IP within those agreements. I have found Chinese courts will enforce
Really?
the oh yes, I mean, I have a case right now where several where trademark was stolen, basically. And it's, we're slowly but surely getting our trademark back, fighting it, sometimes by province, but we're getting there. And ultimately, I believe we will be able to successfully register that trademark in
Hmm.
our own client's
But
name.
what about tech IP? I mean, it's been said that built into contracts that the United States, that American companies have with joint partners in China, is the requirement that these American companies share their technology IP, which they pushed against. That, I mean, otherwise they don't do
Sure.
business in China.
Right, right. Well, again, I think that's an outdated mode of business in China.
Hmm.
It used to be that in order to enter China, you had to have a joint venture partner. And I think there was a lot of leverage there where there was no, I wouldn't call it necessarily you were forced to do it. But by law, but I think through other means in terms of getting a license or getting some approval for something else, it was something that either the locals would require, or the just that your joint venture partner would somewhat leverage the need to have this partner to then get access to it. Today, again, I think it's I have not entered into a joint venture relationship with a Chinese partner in quite a long time. Most of our clients will enter China on their own, and again take appropriate steps to protect their IP. I
Hmm.
believe though there are strategies you can use if going into China with a joint venture partner. Then you don't necessarily take your crown jewel of IP to China. Let's say you're on version 6.0, maybe you take version
Ah.
4.0 or
Hmm.
version 5.0. Or if you're going to have some of your components manufactured in China, maybe again the real critical pieces of that are manufactured outside of China. So there's a lot of things you can do. I'm not telling you though that there is no IP theft, especially in technology, because there is, and it is something that I believe the United States is trying its best to help U.S. companies, and I'm hopeful that China, as it develops more and more of its own IP, again will be protective of IP for all.
Hmm.
But you have to also look at where China is in its development. It needs it can't wait the 40 or 50 years, so let's say, that we had to develop our IP to help us move along that manufacturing food chain. So we're doing now all this advanced manufacturing. It is so critical to keep everyone employed in China, and you can't keep making socks and T-shirts in China and maintain the standard of living. You have to now be able to
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
have some of that higher value add. They either have to go develop it themselves, acquire it, right, licensing or what have you,
Hmm.
or steal it. Well, they don't have the time to develop it. We've made it, and I say we meaning not only us but other Western developed nations are making it more difficult to license that technology. And so I think at some point they just feel like, well, this is the only option that's available to us.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that's kind of where we are and why I think it happens more
Okay.
than you want.
I want to ask you generally about the issue of imposition of tariffs, because this
Yes.
administration has been very aggressive in levying tariffs, sidestepping Congress's responsibility for doing so by citing issues of national security and emergency powers. Is that something that was unique or different from this administration to past administrations? And can we expect that to end in a Biden administration? Just tell me about how much we'll be willing to pull the trigger
Right.
on tariffs in
Right.
the future.
Yeah, I think you're going to see tariffs stay, not maybe to the same level as, say, with President Trump and his administration, in that they really took that as that big stick, and they
Hmm.
would then use, I'll call it almost economic coercion sometimes, to then try to obtain other policy concessions. But again, let's focus on the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, for example. We impose these tariffs on a number of our allies and others. I think what you're going to see there is maybe should see maybe a rollback of some of those tariffs with our key allies, Canada, Mexico, Europe, UK. And I say rollback, I'm not saying, again, you're going to see them totally disappear, but I think some arrangements will be made to make that a lot more palatable, because again, this goes to a bigger issue with the Biden administration. They're looking more for multilateral cooperation on
Hmm.
trade and trade related issues to then be used to go fight some of these other issues like China stealing IP and the rest. So
Right.
I think you'll see something there. But again, the steel industry and the aluminum industry has a lot of supporters within the Midwest states that Biden was just able to flip: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. And so those voters are very, very important, for let's say continued success, I believe, for either the Democrats or the Republicans. I mean, because they both were able to use those three states to gain the presidency. So I think you'll see some softening, but not going away completely, because that industry
Hmm.
is so important. On the
Okay.
301 tariffs with China, again, I just don't. You just can't say, well, that was a bad idea, we're going to let those go. I think the Biden administration is going to try to seek some kind of concessions there from China as a way to maybe reduce the tariffs, at least the scope of the tariffs. I think maybe initially you'll see a review, and to the extent that any goods that we need, say, to fight COVID, or some other important issues, I think you may see tariffs be excluded there. But I think you're going to see China tariffs for a while, and also because a lot of these tariffs, whether 232 steel and aluminum or on China, they've all been factored in, right,
Hmm.
to the pricing and to supply chains. And so at this point, I just don't see there's as much of a need to get rid of them. Although I'm hopeful, because I'm more of a free trade. I don't like tariffs. I don't think they really help. That's not my policy option of choice. I'm hoping over time, though, they get reduced and only used maybe in very specific situations to redress very specific issues.
Hmm. What kind of shift do you think? Do you think we'll see on kind of a made in America policy from the United States? I mean, we're talking in the form of perhaps like tax credits and the like. Do you think this administration will have a different approach to pushing reshoring and manufacturing here in this country?
No, again, I think there's bipartisan support around trying to reshore U.S. manufacturing to create more jobs here in the United States. Again, how they go about it may be a little different. So, for example, with the Trump administration, what he was proposing if he was to win re-election, he was going to propose a surtax on any U.S. company that went offshore to manufacture, right?
Hmm.
Regardless of the purpose. So what we've seen as a result of the pandemic, and also as a result of some of the issues with China in general, you're seeing kind of a shift in supply chains where I think we've talked about this before, to these regional supply chains. So let's say if I'm going to supply or I'm going to sell in Asia, I'm going to move my supply chain there. It's that kind of behavior should not necessarily be subject to a surtax. It's just good business. Those profits are coming back to the United States. It's But in the Trump administration, that he would tax that. President Biden would not. According to his policies or what he proposed in his plan, he would only tax or put a surtax on, let's say I moved from the US to China to manufacture, and then I sold my products back in the United States, or I moved a
Hmm.
call center from, say, the United States to somewhere in the Caribbean, for example, but that was to provide services back in the United States. That kind of, I'll say, offshoring or would be subject to his surtax. Then he's got his Made America, which I think they're somewhat similar in this Made in America kind of approach, for government procurement.
Hmm.
Although the President-elect Biden has talked about how he would close some of the loopholes that existed under the Trump plan that allowed certain goods, for agencies to get waivers, and so they still could go out and buy the foreign products. My concern with these Buy America plans is that we have granted concessions in a variety of free trade agreements around the world to open up government procurement to non-U.S. Companies. Much like when we negotiate these agreements, we want to be able to say participate in government procurement in these other countries. And I'm
Sure.
afraid sometimes we get we push it a little too far, and we may run afoul then of our treaty commitments that we've already made. But
Uh-huh.
I think, though, with President Biden, you will see on the tax credits, he's focused a lot around this idea of investing in, let's say, facilities that are about to close or on the verge of closing or have closed. Which I think is a great idea, because it helps some of these communities that maybe been impacted in the past by free trade agreements or globalization or automation, to help maybe revitalize their communities. There's also a commitment to rural broadband and bringing reliable broadband to these same communities. Then he's got like retooling certain manufacturing facilities. So, for example, where I live, the GM Spring Hill plant is now going to produce the electric Cadillac. They're going to have to retool, so there'd be an advanceable
Mm.
tax credit available for that and that kind of retooling. And then also any reshoring back to the United States, where again creating more U.S. jobs or increasing U.S. payrolls within existing manufacturing. Those also be that 10% credit will also be available. So
Yeah.
I think they're really going to make a real push for this. Now the question is going to be, though, I just saw that in North Carolina, the Republicans claimed that Senate seat. So now they're 49-48 with Alaska out, which is likely to go Republican as well. So that would put them at 50. Depending on what happens now in Georgia, really, with the Senate races, let's assume that the Republicans maintain control. it'll be really interesting to see how much of this, though, can President Biden push through. I
Right.
believe a lot of this should have bipartisan support. It's going to be really tough to say I'm not for some of this, but
Mhm.
as you know, we're in this day where sometimes just before we put party before country, and we
Yeah.
may see a lot of pushback on some of these policies. So I think in all of what we've discussed, a lot of it will depend on, especially it needs congressional approval, how the Senate goes, and then how well maybe a President-elect Biden and a Senate Majority Leader McConnell can maybe use their prior relationship to maybe get some of this done.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like there won't be maybe as many changes as we thought. There will be some, but John Scannapieco of Baker Donelson, thank you for the nuance in your observations about just how we might see U.S. trade policy changing or not under a Biden administration. We'll certainly be looking forward to it and connect up with you at a later date to review what actually happened.
I know.
So thank you
Happy to do
so
it.
thank you so
No,
much for
thank you.
being with me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye now.